The town of Frederick, Colorado, stood nestled beneath the towering Rockies, a place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. It was a community where families flourished in quiet comfort, and everyone knew each other by name. At least, that's how it seemed to the outside world. The Watts family embodied that ideal, a picture-perfect image of success and happiness. But behind the scenes, there were whispers in the shadows, a growing disconnect between Chris and Shanann that no one could see. Chris Watts, an oil worker by trade, was the type of man who wore his love for his family on his sleeve. To the people around him, he was a devoted husband and father, always smiling, always ready to help. His posts on social media showed his children, Bella and Celeste, laughing under the sun, surrounded by the warmth of family. Shanann, pregnant with their third child, was often the one behind the camera, her voice brimming with excitement about the future. Everything appeared perfect, but beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Shanann had always been the energetic social one, always planning, always organizing. Yet, something had shifted. Chris, the man who had once been her rock, seemed increasingly distant. His work schedule became erratic, and when he was home, he was distracted, absent. She noticed his lack of interest in their conversations, the subtle coldness in his responses. But she pushed the thoughts aside. He was just stressed, she convinced herself. After all, he had a demanding job, and their third child was on the way. The couple's marriage had always been the foundation of their family's happiness, but even that began to feel fragile. Shanann's intuition told her something was wrong, but she didn't know what. She wasn't sure whether to trust her instincts or to chalk it up to stress. Every time she tried to confront Chris about his behavior, he would shrug it off with the same excuse, "I'm just tired, Shan." For Chris, the weight of his actions was already beginning to bear down on him, though no one could see it. His affair with Nicole Kessinger, a woman from his workplace, was secret and still growing. The emotional distance he was creating between himself and Shanann was a result of his desire to step away from his life, to pursue a new beginning, a new life, free from the responsibilities that he felt suffocated him. Nicole seemed like an escape from the emotional turmoil he had created for himself, a temporary relief from the weight of his marriage. His conversations with Nicole were innocent at first, just work-related. But gradually they became something more, something forbidden. His texts with her grew more intimate, more flirtatious, until it was clear to him that he was emotionally invested. He justified it in his mind, telling himself that he deserved to be happy, that he deserved someone who understood him. Shanann, in his mind, had become a burden. One evening, as Shanann prepared dinner, Chris sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. A message from Nicole popped up on the screen, a subtle but unmistakable flirtation. The guilt gnawed at Chris, but he ignored it, continuing to exchange messages with her, pretending that everything was fine at home. He couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't admit to the affair that was consuming him. Shanann walked into the room and noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. "What's wrong, Chris?" she asked, her voice light but laced with concern. He smiled tightly, his eyes avoiding hers. "Nothing, just tired." She studied him for a moment, wondering if she was imagining things, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Shanann had a sinking feeling in her stomach. This was no longer just about stress. There was something deeper at play. In the quiet of their home, as Shanann busied herself with the children, Chris retreated further into himself. He knew that the more he distanced himself, the more difficult it would be to keep his secrets hidden, but he was determined to press on. He believed that if he could just keep up the facade a little longer, he could leave everything behind and start fresh with Nicole. Little did he know, Shanann's instincts were beginning to catch up with her. She started looking for answers in places she had never thought to check. The small clues, the changes in his behavior, they didn't add up, but she wasn't ready to confront him fully. Not yet. The illusion of the perfect family was too important to her. Shanann stood in the doorway watching Chris from the kitchen, her mind racing. She had tried to push away the unsettling thoughts, but they refused to leave. Every moment felt like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of their once happy marriage. Chris had become a shadow of the man she had fallen in love with. The late nights, the emotional distance. She couldn't ignore it any longer. As she chopped vegetables for dinner, her gaze fell on Chris, his face lit up by the glow of his phone. She had learned to ignore his late-night phone habits, telling herself it was just work, just the stress of his job. But now it felt like more. She noticed the familiar pattern. He would glance at his phone, hide it quickly when she walked into the room, and then go back to what he was doing. Her heart sank. Was she imagining things? Had she become paranoid? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of her grasp, something that didn't belong to her anymore. The love that used to be there between them had somehow faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow space that she couldn't understand. Shanann's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Chris's phone vibrating on the counter. Without thinking, she walked over, her fingers brushing the screen, and there it was. A message from Nickel. The name alone sent a shock through her body. "Hey, babe, I miss you. Can't wait to see you again tonight." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. She hadn't imagined it. This wasn't just about work stress. This was something else entirely. Shanann's heart raced. She took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had found the first piece of evidence, the first undeniable confirmation that her husband was having an affair. Her mind raced. What now? What was she supposed to do with this? She stared at the message for a long moment, as if trying to convince herself that it wasn't real. But it was. With trembling hands, Shanann set the phone down and turned away. She needed time to process this, to think about what it meant, what it would mean for their family. But her world had already begun to shatter around her piece by piece. Later that evening, Chris came home, his usual smile stretched across his face as if everything were fine. Shanann could barely look at him. She felt sick to her stomach, the betrayal burning inside her. How could he do this? How could he do this to their family? As dinner was set on the table, the silence between them was unbearable. Shanann pushed the food around her plate, avoiding his gaze. Chris noticed, his brow furrowing, but he said nothing. He didn't know that his world was about to be exposed. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it all came rushing out in a single piercing question. "Who is she, Chris?" Shanann's voice shook as she looked directly at him. Chris froze. His face went pale, but he quickly masked his shock with a casual shrug. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "I saw the messages," Shanann replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an edge of pain that cut through the air. "I saw the texts from Nicole. I know about the affair, Chris." For a moment, there was silence. Chris's eyes darted away, and Shanann felt her heart break. He hadn't even the decency to look her in the eye. His guilt was obvious, but his mouth stayed sealed. Finally, he muttered, "It's not what you think, But Shanann interrupted him, her voice rising. "Don't you dare lie to me. How long, Chris? How long have you been seeing her? And how long were you planning on hiding it from me? From us?" Chris opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He couldn't answer her, not in a way that would save him. "I didn't want to hurt you," he finally said, his words soft and filled with regret, though his voice didn't carry the weight of sincerity. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But the words rang hollow in Shanann's ears. The reality was undeniable now. The man she thought she knew, the man she thought she could trust, had been lying to her for months, perhaps even longer. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized the depth of his deception. In that moment, Shanann understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just an affair. It was the end of the person she thought she knew, the person she had built a life with. Chris's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was a complete destruction of their family's trust. She stood up from the table, pushing her chair back harshly, and walked toward the door. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said, her voice breaking with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Chris didn't stop her as she left. He didn't chase after her, didn't try to explain himself. He knew it was over. For the first time in months, Shanann felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. The man she had married was gone. The man she loved was now just a stranger, someone who had broken her heart in the worst way possible. As she sat in the quiet of her bedroom, the reality of what had happened set in. The family she had worked so hard to build, the life she thought they were sharing, was shattered beyond repair. The next few days were a blur for Shanann. The confrontation with Chris had left her feeling both emotionally drained and numb. She couldn't escape the image of his face as he stood there denying everything, his words twisting and contorting in an attempt to minimize the magnitude of what had happened. She had suspected something was wrong for months, but now that she knew, the pain felt unbearable. Her thoughts were a constant whirlwind of confusion. How could he do this to her? How could he betray the vows they had made to each other? He had been everything to her, the man she trusted with her life, and now she realized that trust had been shattered beyond repair. She needed answers, not just from him, but from the world that had allowed her to live in this illusion. In the days following the confrontation, Shanann's anger turned to determination. She could no longer sit by and allow Chris to control the narrative. She had to know the full extent of his betrayal. She had to find out what was going on, even if it meant facing the truth she wasn't ready to hear. Shanann's next move was a quiet one. She started checking Chris's phone, looking for any more clues she could find. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but something deep inside told her this was the only way to understand the depths of his lies. What she found was far more than she had expected. She scrolled through message after message, each one more damning than the last. The exchanges between Chris and Nickel were filled with affection and longing, with words that left no room for doubt. He had been planning this for months, his love for Nickel evident in every line. Shanann felt her stomach twist as she read through the details of their meetings, the secret trips he had taken without her, and the constant promises of a new life that they would build together. The discovery hit her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just an affair, it was an entire life Chris had been building behind her back, a life that had left her out in the cold. How could he have been so cruel, so deceitful, while pretending to be the perfect husband and father? The room felt like it was closing in on her. She had always prided herself on being the strong one, the one who kept everything together for her family. But now, she was broken. The man she had loved, the man she had supported through thick and thin, had been living a double life, and she was left to pick up the pieces. But Shanann wasn't done. She wasn't going to let Chris off so easily. As much as it hurt, she needed to confront him again. She needed to hear it from him directly. She needed him to admit to the depth of his lies. She would not let him get away with this. When she finally sat down to face him again, the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. Chris knew what was coming. He had no excuse, no way to talk his way out of it this time. But he still tried, of course. He still tried to twist the story, to minimize what had happened, to make it seem like it wasn't as bad as it was. But Shanann wasn't buying it anymore. She had seen enough. She had read enough. The lies were too many to ignore. "You lied to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with the kind of fury that only betrayal could bring. "For how long, Chris? How long have you been living this lie?" Chris's face fell. The guilt was palpable, but there was something else there too. Something darker, more sinister. He tried to apologize, tried to offer excuses, but Shanann wasn't interested. She didn't need his apologies anymore. She needed him to face what he had done, to admit to the reality of his actions. "I can't do this anymore," Shanann said, her voice steady, though the pain was clear in her eyes. "I can't live in this lie with you. I don't even know who you are anymore." Chris stood frozen, as if the weight of her words had shattered something inside him. He had never expected this. He had assumed that he could continue his secret life and maintain the facade of a happy family. But now, there was no denying it. Shanann knew, and nothing he could say would change that. As the silence between them stretched on, Shanann took a deep breath. She could feel the walls closing in on her. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. She turned to leave the room, her heart heavy with grief and anger. She had given him everything, her trust, her love, and her loyalty. And now she was left with nothing but the painful reality of his betrayal. The silence between Shanann and Chris was suffocating. The walls of their home felt like they were closing in on her. Her heart ached, but her mind was racing. Everything she had once known to be true about their life together was now a lie. She could still feel the sting of his betrayal in every corner of the house. It was impossible to escape. She had been patient, trying to piece together their broken relationship. She had confronted him, asked for answers, and yet he continued to lie. It was becoming clear to her now that there was no future with Chris. The man she had given everything to, the man who had promised to love and cherish her. He had already made his decision. He had made his choice, and it wasn't her. The tension between them had only grown since the night of the confrontation. Chris avoided her when he could, and when they did speak, it was as if he wasn't even there. The distance between them had become a chasm that no words could bridge. Shanann's suspicions, her fears, they were now undeniable truths. In the days that followed, Shanann began to notice something else. Chris was acting differently. He seemed colder, more withdrawn. She could see the way he would look at his phone, the way he would quickly hide it when she entered the room. The same patterns, the same telltale signs. And it was all too much to bear. She had hoped for reconciliation, but now she knew she was fooling herself. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The reality of the situation was inescapable. Chris was no longer the man she thought she knew. She had been living a lie for far too long. That morning, when she saw him walking around the house, avoiding her gaze as usual, something inside her broke. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted. She couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't stand his coldness, his indifference. She couldn't stand the lies that had come between them. "Chris," she called out, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't answer. He was lost in his thoughts, his mind elsewhere. She stepped forward, her voice rising. "Chris, look at me." He turned slowly, his face blank. For a moment, he didn't speak. Shanann could feel the tension building, the storm that had been brewing inside of her finally reaching its peak. "I know you don't care anymore," she said, the words barely escaping her lips. "I know you've already made your choice, but I need you to understand one thing. I deserve more than this. I deserve more than being lied to, more than living in this twisted version of a marriage that you've created. I'm done." Chris's eyes shifted, but he said nothing. His silence felt like a slap to her face. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't trying to explain himself. He wasn't even fighting for her. And that was the breaking point. Shanann realized that the man she had spent years building a life with was gone, and he wasn't coming back. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, staring at the man she once loved. The hurt, the betrayal, it all consumed her. But there was something else too, relief. The weight that had been hanging over her shoulders for so long was finally starting to lift. She had to let go. She couldn't keep holding on to someone who had already let go of her. With a final look, Shanann walked out of the room, not knowing where to go or what to do next, but knowing she couldn't stay in that house any longer. It was no longer a home. It was a prison. As she stepped out into the cool morning air, she could hear her heartbeat in her ears, loud and steady. The world outside seemed so vast, so open. She was free, free from the lies, free from the pain, free from the man who had once promised to be everything to her. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. She had no idea what the future would hold. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Chris's betrayal define her life any longer. The days following the confrontation were a blur of confusion and pain for Shanann. Her heart felt like it had been ripped out, and yet a strange sense of clarity was beginning to take root. She had confronted Chris with the undeniable truth of his affair, and in return he had offered nothing but empty excuses. He had apologized, but it didn't matter anymore. The trust that once held their relationship together had been shattered beyond repair. As the silence between them grew, Shanann knew there was more to the story. The messages, the lies, she had only scratched the surface. Her intuition told her that the deception ran deeper than she could imagine. She wasn't just dealing with a husband who had cheated. She was dealing with someone who had been living a completely different life behind her back. One night, when Chris was out of the house, Shanann took a deep breath and made a decision. She had to know everything. She couldn't keep living in the dark, hoping the pieces would somehow fall into place. She needed the full picture, even if it meant facing the ugly truth. She knew it wasn't healthy to invade his privacy, but at this point, she couldn't afford to turn a blind eye. Shanann went to his laptop, hesitated for a moment, and then opened the files. She didn't even know what she was looking for, but instinct told her she'd know when she found it. The first few clicks were harmless, just old work documents, family photos, nothing that stood out. But then, buried deep in his saved messages, she found it. Another set of messages, this time between Chris and Nicole Kessinger. Their conversations were filled with more intimate details than Shanann had ever wanted to know. The words were full of promises, flirtations, and plans for a future together. Shanann's hands shook as she scrolled through the messages. "I can't wait to leave her," one message read. "We'll finally be free to live our lives, just you and me. No more lies, no more pretending." Shanann felt a sharp pang in her chest. How long had this been going on? How many times had Chris looked at her and lied, all while building a new future with someone else? The betrayal stung in a way she hadn't thought possible. He wasn't just having an affair. He was planning a life without her. The realization hit her like a wave. Every word in those messages spoke of a future Chris had been building without her in it. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart, was gone. In his place was someone who had been secretly plotting to leave everything behind. Shanann couldn't bring herself to read anymore. Her chest felt tight, and her vision blurred with tears. She had been living a lie for so long, and now the truth was more painful than she could have ever imagined. But as she sat there, holding the weight of the reality in her hands, something inside her shifted. The sadness, the anger, the betrayal, they were all still there. But there was also something else, a deep, raw sense of clarity. She wasn't going to allow herself to be a part of his deception any longer. She wasn't going to wait for him to make the next move. Shanann took a deep breath and closed the laptop. She didn't know what her next step would be, but she knew that she couldn't continue living in this toxic relationship. The person she had loved was gone, and there was no fixing what had been broken. That night, as she lay in bed, Shanann made a vow to herself. She was going to rebuild her life. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she was done living in the shadow of Chris's lies. She was done being the victim of his betrayal. In the quiet of the night, with only the sound of her own breath in the room, Shanann felt something she hadn't in a long time: control. The pain was still there, raw and unyielding, but it no longer defined her. She would take back her life, no matter the cost. Shanann had always prided herself on being able to handle life's difficulties with grace. But in the aftermath of discovering Chris's affair, she felt like everything she had ever known had shattered. Each day seemed harder than the last, as the weight of his betrayal pressed down on her. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but more than that, she felt a quiet, gnawing sense of emptiness. The person she had trusted above all others had turned out to be a stranger. The days passed in a blur of tension. Every time Chris spoke to her, his words felt like lies, even when they weren't. The atmosphere in the house was thick with discomfort. They no longer shared meals or conversation. The small gestures that had once brought them close were now replaced with silence and avoidance. Chris seemed to sense that Shanann was no longer the woman he had married. He would glance at her occasionally, his eyes flickering with guilt, but he never said anything. His presence in the house felt like a shadow, distant, absent, but always there, lurking. Shanann knew that Chris was hiding something more. The affair had already been uncovered, but she sensed that there were still things he wasn't telling her. His sudden emotional withdrawal only added to the growing suspicion that there was more to this story than just infidelity. It was on a quiet afternoon that the first cracks in his behavior began to show in full force. Shanann had noticed that Chris had been more secretive than ever. His phone, which used to sit openly on the kitchen counter, was now always hidden. The secrecy only deepened the divide between them, and Shanann's growing frustration pushed her to investigate further. One evening, as Chris stepped out for a brief errand, Shanann, with an uneasy resolve, picked up his phone from the counter. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't ignore the pressing need for answers. As she unlocked the screen, her breath caught. It wasn't just the messages with Nickel that caught her eye. It was the new ones that seemed more personal, more telling. She scrolled through the messages with growing disbelief. There were arrangements for secret meetings, declarations of love, and promises for a future beyond their marriage. The words that stuck with her most were simple, but devastating. "I wish I could just be with you forever." The reality of the situation crashed down on Shanann once again. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete emotional abandonment. Chris was no longer pretending to be the man he once was. His future was with Nickel, and Shanann had just become an obstacle in his path. Shanann's hands trembled as she set the phone down. The tears she had been holding back for days finally began to fall, silently. It was as if she had been standing at the edge of an abyss, and now the truth had pushed her over the edge. There was no more pretending. The life she had been trying to salvage was already gone, and Chris had made it clear that he had moved on. When Chris returned home, Shanann didn't speak. The anger, the betrayal, it had all built to this moment. She had nothing left to say to him. The man she had loved was gone, and the man standing in front of her was a stranger. She had tried to reach out, tried to make sense of the wreckage he had caused, but now she knew there was no way back. "Shanann," Chris started, his voice weak, as if searching for the right words. But she couldn't hear him anymore. Every word he spoke felt like a lie. Every apology felt empty. She was no longer interested in his excuses. "I don't know what happened," he muttered, his voice filled with guilt. "I don't know how it got this far." Shanann didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was too clear now. She wasn't going to wait for him to fix things. She wasn't going to keep hoping for a man who had already chosen someone else. The woman who stood before him now wasn't the same person who had once believed in their future. That woman was gone. As Chris stood there, waiting for her to say something, Shanann finally spoke, but her words were soft, measured. "You made your choice, Chris. You don't get to choose me anymore." She walked away, not looking back, and as she did, she could feel the weight of the years they had spent together slowly slipping away from her. This was the breaking point. This was where she drew the line. Shanann sat in the quiet of the living room, her thoughts swirling like a storm. It had been days since their last confrontation, and yet the weight of Chris's betrayal still hung heavily in the air. She had come to a bitter realization. There was no fixing this. He had broken something irreplaceable, and now it was time for the final reckoning. She hadn't expected it to happen this way, but she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The lies, the deceit, they had taken their toll on her heart. Shanann's emotions were a mixture of hurt, rage, and disbelief. But there was one feeling that outshone the rest: resignation. She knew now that Chris wasn't the man she had once believed him to be. Chris walked in from the garage, his face as closed off as ever. He had been quiet, almost withdrawn, as though he knew what was coming but wasn't prepared to face it. He stood in the doorway, glancing at her for a moment before looking away. The familiar warmth of their home felt cold and empty now. Shanann's voice cut through the silence. "Chris, we need to talk." He hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before he nodded, walking toward her. His movements were slow, almost reluctant, as if he was bracing himself for something worse than what had already happened. "I can't keep doing this," Shanann said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I can't keep living with this lie. You've betrayed me in ways I can't even understand." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "You've been lying to me for so long, and now I know everything." Chris didn't respond right away. His face was a mix of guilt and fear, but there was no real apology in his eyes. He had known this moment would come, but he was not ready to face the consequences of his actions. "I don't know what you want me to say, Shanann," Chris muttered, his voice low. "I'm sorry, okay? I made a mistake." Shanann's heart twisted at his words, but she had no more patience for his excuses. The truth was already out there, and his half-hearted apology only deepened the wound. She stood up, her hands shaking as she looked him in the eye. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "A mistake?" You've been seeing her for months. You've been planning a future with her. You've been lying to me, to our children, and I deserve more than your empty words." Chris's eyes faltered for a brief moment. He couldn't meet her gaze anymore, his silence speaking volumes. The weight of his lies pressed on him, and Shanann could see the guilt eating at him, but there was still no real admission, no real acknowledgement of the depth of what he had done. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. "I never wanted any of this. But I got caught up in something I couldn't control. I thought I could fix things, but I couldn't." The words hung in the air, but Shanann couldn't bring herself to listen to his excuses anymore. She had heard enough. This wasn't about what Chris had wanted. This was about the years of trust, the years of love that he had destroyed with his selfish choices. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she let his words sink in. "No, Chris. You didn't get caught up in anything. You chose this. You chose her. And you lied to me every step of the way." Chris opened his mouth as if to respond, but Shanann stopped him with a raised hand. "I don't need your justification anymore. I'm done. I'm done trying to understand your decisions. I'm done trying to make sense of your lies." Her voice cracked as she continued, her heart breaking with every word. "You've chosen her over me, over our family, and that choice is final." The silence between them grew heavy. Shanann could feel the weight of what she was saying, the finality of it all. Chris had already chosen his path, and now Shanann had to choose hers. "I know I've messed up," Chris said softly, his voice full of regret. "I've destroyed everything. I don't know how to make it right, but I'm sorry." Shanann shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't want his apology anymore. She didn't want to hear him beg for forgiveness. She had given him every opportunity to come clean, to admit the truth, but he had kept lying. And now the reality of it all was too much to bear. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she whispered. "I'm asking for the strength to move on, to live without you, because I can't do this anymore." Chris stood frozen, his eyes full of regret, but there was nothing more to say. The damage had been done, and Shanann had finally found the courage to walk away from the man who had shattered her world. The house felt eerily silent after Shanann's words had sunk in. The finality of her declaration echoed in the empty rooms. Chris was still there, standing in the same spot, his face a mixture of guilt and disbelief. But Shanann was no longer the woman who would stand by and wait for him to change. She had given him every chance, but he had made his choice. Now, there was nothing left but the cold reality of what they had lost. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Shanann moved through the motions, tending to the children, but her heart was heavy with a deep sorrow she could not yet articulate. The family she had built her entire life had been turned upside down. Every corner of the house felt like a painful reminder of everything that had crumbled away. Chris, on the other hand, was lost in his own guilt and regret. His attempts to apologize and explain were met with silence. Shanann had shut him out completely, unwilling to listen to the hollow excuses he continued to offer. His apologies now felt more like a distant echo than any form of reconciliation. He had broken her trust, and that trust was something she could never get back. The children, Bella and Celeste, seemed oblivious to the turmoil. They went about their days with the innocence that only children could possess, unaware of the quiet tension that hung between their parents. Shanann, though deeply affected, tried her best to shield them from the wreckage that was unfolding. But it was getting harder to pretend that everything was okay. Chris, for all his efforts to be involved, was no longer the man he once was. His once constant presence had turned into an uncomfortable shadow that haunted the house. He spent his days wandering the house aimlessly, avoiding Shanann, and spending more time on his phone, often texting or speaking with Nicole. His guilt was evident, but it was too late. Shanann had seen through his mask of contrition. She had been living a lie for too long to believe in any more empty promises. The reality was clear now. Chris was no longer the man she had married. He had been replaced by someone else, someone she didn't recognize, and she couldn't continue living with that person. One evening, after another tense silence had stretched for hours, Shanann could no longer keep her thoughts bottled up. She had to say what was on her mind, even if it meant facing Chris's cold indifference. "Chris," she began, her voice firm but tinged with the exhaustion of everything they had been through. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending like this is a marriage. It's not. Not anymore." Chris looked up at her, his eyes tired and filled with regret, but he said nothing. He had no defense, no justification left. "You've chosen your path," she continued, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "And I've chosen mine. I won't be part of this deception any longer." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle between them. Chris shifted uncomfortably but still didn't speak. His silence was now his answer. Shanann felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in days. This wasn't the life she wanted for herself, nor for her children. And she was no longer going to stand idly by, waiting for a change that would never come. "I don't need your apologies anymore," she said, her voice softer now, the exhaustion of the emotional battle weighing heavily on her. "I need to move forward. I need to find a way to heal, and I can't do that while you're here reminding me of all the lies." Chris stood there staring at her, but this time there was no attempt to explain himself. No attempt to fix things. It was too late for that. Shanann didn't wait for him to speak. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. She was done trying to fix something that could never be fixed. Later that evening, as she lay in bed, Shanann thought about the road ahead. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. It would be better without Chris in it. She had to start over, not just for herself, but for her children. They deserved more than this toxic environment. They deserved a life filled with love, trust, and stability, things Chris could no longer provide. As the darkness of the night closed in around her, Shanann made a vow to herself. She would move forward. She would find her strength, rebuild her life, and heal from the wounds Chris had inflicted. It wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid. The pain of betrayal would fade, but the clarity she had gained would guide her from this moment forward. The courtroom was filled with a tense energy, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness that permeated the air. Shanann's family had flown in from North Carolina, the pain in their eyes evident as they sat in the front row, their hearts heavy with grief and the unrelenting desire for justice. This trial, the culmination of months of pain and deceit, would finally lay bare the truth. Chris sat in the defendant's chair, his once confident demeanor long gone. His face was pale, his eyes tired, and his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of what he had done was now more than he could bear. Every glance he exchanged with Shanann's family felt like a silent admission of guilt, yet there was no real remorse in his expression. He had already confessed, but the truth of his actions was still hauntingly inadequate compared to the lives he had taken. The trial had been long, dragging on with testimony after testimony, each moment revealing more about Chris's life before the murders. The defense tried to paint him as a man overwhelmed by stress, trapped in a deteriorating marriage, and manipulated by his affair with Nicole. But every word they spoke was met with the silent, resolute faces of Shanann's loved ones who had heard enough of Chris's justifications. The prosecution didn't hold back. They laid out the evidence in stark detail, the video footage of Chris's movements, the messages between him and Nicole, and the chilling confession he had made to the police. But what weighed most heavily on the case was the heart-wrenching testimony from Shanann's family and friends. They spoke of her kindness, her optimism, and the joy she had brought into the world, especially her children, Bella and Celeste. Each testimony was a painful reminder of what Chris had stolen from them, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the man they once knew was gone, replaced by a murderer who had taken everything he wanted at any cost. The prosecution's final argument was direct and unyielding. Chris Watts had killed his wife Shanann and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, not out of self-defense, not in a moment of rage over a petty argument, but to escape a life he no longer wanted. It wasn't just the crime of killing his family. It was the cold, calculated steps he took afterward to cover up the murders, the lies he told to the police, and the chilling calm with which he confessed. Shanann's family, despite their grief, remained composed, their eyes not leaving Chris as they processed the enormity of what had happened. They spoke, one by one, their voices trembling with anger but tinged with an overwhelming sorrow. Her mother, in particular, spoke of the heartbreak of losing her daughter in such a brutal, senseless way. Her father, barely able to contain his tears, spoke of the loss of not just a daughter but of two innocent grandchildren who would never have the chance to grow up and fulfill their potential. The defense tried one last time to appeal to the judge, suggesting a lesser sentence, arguing that Chris had shown some remorse for his actions. But as the judge turned to face Chris, the weight of the decision was palpable in the room. There was no escaping the fact that this man, who had once been seen as a loving husband and father, had committed an unimaginable crime. Chris Watts, you have taken the lives of 3 innocent people. You have left a legacy of pain and sorrow that will last for generations. There is no justification for what you've done, the judge said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. Shanann's family held their breath as the verdict was read. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Chris's face remained blank, but inside his world had crumbled. He would never again have the chance to rebuild, to start anew. His life was over in more ways than one. Shanann's family reacted quietly, a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring back the lives that had been taken. No verdict, no sentence, could ever undo the damage Chris had caused. But at least there was closure. At least now they could begin to heal, even if that healing would take years. As the courtroom emptied, Shanann's mother turned to her family, her eyes filled with tears. "She would have wanted us to be strong," she whispered, holding her head high as they walked out of the room. It was over, but the scars would remain forever. The aftermath of Chris's trial had left a sense of finality in the air. Shanann's family had done everything they could to ensure justice was served, but despite the conviction, there was still something lingering, something unresolved. Shanann's family, especially her parents, had always felt there were pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit, questions that, even after the trial, remained unanswered. And now, with Chris behind bars for the rest of his life, the truth seemed to be slowly unspooling, revealing a deeper, more chilling side to the story. Months had passed since the trial, but the pain of losing Shanann, Bella, and Celeste never fully dissipated. Shanann's family carried on, trying to rebuild their lives, but they had never stopped seeking answers to the lingering questions that kept them awake at night. What had driven Chris to commit such heinous acts? What was the true extent of his relationship with Nicole Kessinger? Was there someone else involved in this tragedy? Then one day, an unexpected revelation came to light. It wasn't just about Chris's infidelity. It wasn't even about his obsession with Nicole. The discovery wasn't about a single mistake or a rash decision made in a moment of anger. It was something darker, something premeditated. The authorities had recently uncovered more of Chris's private documents, letters, texts, and a series of emails between him and Nicole, as well as journals where Chris had meticulously detailed his emotional turmoil and plans. Among these documents was a letter he had written to Nicole, one that had never been sent. It was a confession, not just about his marriage, but about his entire life. Chris had detailed his intentions in a way that sent chills down the spine of those who read it. In the letter, Chris admitted to plotting the deaths of his wife and children long before the fatal night. His desire to escape his life had reached such a boiling point that he had written about the need to be free, to leave his family behind without the weight of guilt. He justified his actions, blaming Shanann's controlling nature and their failed marriage. But what struck Shanann's family the hardest was the cold, calculated nature of his plan. This wasn't an impulsive act driven by anger. It was a decision made over time, carefully calculated and carried out with chilling precision. The full depth of Chris's manipulations became clear. His relationship with Nicole had only been one part of a larger emotional and psychological breakdown. He had not just been cheating, he had been preparing for a future where Shanann and the children no longer existed. He had even made attempts to reconcile with Shanann in an effort to normalize things before carrying out his crime, to make it look like the perfect family once again. This final revelation sent shockwaves through Shanann's family. They had known he was capable of betrayal, but this was a level of darkness they hadn't expected. They were haunted by the thought that Chris had been playing a game all along, manipulating everyone in his life, including Nickel, as a pawn in his grand escape plan. For Shanann's parents, it was a devastating blow. The man they had once welcomed into their family, the man they had trusted with their daughter's life, had been a monster hiding behind a mask. The question of why lingered in their minds for days, weeks. What had made Chris capable of such cruelty? Was it his affair, his selfish desire for freedom, or was there something deeper, something even darker, lurking within him all along? In the months that followed, as Shanann's family tried to piece together the rest of their lives, they found themselves reeling from the emotional toll of the final discovery. They grieved not only for the lives of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, but for the loss of the man they once thought Chris was. The truth had come to light, but it didn't bring peace. There was no justice that could make this right. No verdict or confession could ever heal the wounds Chris had inflicted on his family. But with the final revelation, at least they understood the full extent of the tragedy. They could finally begin the painful process of healing, knowing that the man who had caused them so much suffering was locked away, never to have the chance to destroy another life. And for Shanann's family, that was the final step in their journey. They had the truth, and now they could finally begin to rebuild, not just for themselves, but for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, whose lives had been stolen too soon. What do you think of Chris Watts and his chilling confession? Do you believe his motives were driven solely by his affair? Or was there something deeper at play? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers all around the world.